Today we're going to make a little transition from Lucretius to Cicero. And before we start, I should talk a little bit about what you should read in so many of the things that we're talking about in this course. There isn't much choice. In the case of Lucretius, that's all we have is that one great poem on the nature of things. That's his complete works. But with Cicero, you have a whole library of books. He's very, very prolific. If you go down to the library and look up Cicero, you'll find, 15 folio volumes of the complete works of Cicero. So we have to be selective. And I do have there is a Penguin Classics book that's a kind of anthology called Cicero on the Good Life. And I've used that anthology, and it does contain most of the things I think that we'll want to talk about here. It begins with they call it the Discussions at Tusculum, or as it's called in Latin, the Tusculan Disputations. And let's see what else is here. Then it has book 2 on duties. And I think you ought to get hold of book 1 on duties and read that as well as book 2. There are 2 other books as well, and if you could find a copy of the whole thing, I would say it would be best for you to read the whole of the On Duties. It isn't really all that long a book, but book 2 is rather inadequate without book 1, so I'd advise you to find a copy of book 1 and have it reproduced. Then there is the Laelius on friendship, and we will talk about that. And finally, there is among other things, there is the Dream of Scipio, the last work in this anthology. So you should read all of those things. We'll take them up in about that order, I would say, too. I know in the Discussions at Tusculum, there is a passage that deals with Epicurus. Cicero is, I suppose we were just saying before we started that Cicero is about as far from Lucretius as you can get. He doesn't talk here about Lucretius. He talks about Epicurus, but of course, as we said, Lucretius is the spokesman for Epicurus. And here's a passage from Cicero in the Discussions at Tusculum. Epicurus's whole theory of pleasure is based on the idea that the reason why this is always attractive and desirable is precisely because it is pleasure. It is pleasure. And the reason why pain cannot fail to be undesirable is because it is pain. This means that if a man has any sense, he will take care to weigh the pros and cons, avoiding pleasure if the pain involved seems likely to predominate, and accepting pain if the inherent pleasure is going to outweigh the disadvantages. And another of Epicurus's doctrines goes as follows. Although the sensations of the body are what provide the means of judging whether a thing is pleasant or not, the pleasure is then passed on by the body and communicated to the mind. Granted that it is the body that feels delight during the actual sensation of a pleasure, the mind derives its own enjoyment as well. Furthermore, the mind possesses an additional function of anticipating pleasures to come and keeping past pleasures alive in the memory. In this way, it is argued the wise man will always have a continuous, unbroken succession of enjoyable experiences, since his anticipation of those he is looking forward to in the future will merge with his recollection of those he has enjoyed in the past. Applying the same arguments to food, Epicurus and the others belittle expensive and sumptuous banquets on the grounds that nature's needs are modest, and need, anyone can see, is what provides the seasoning for any and every appetite. When Darius was fleeing from Alexander, he managed to get a drink of some muddy water polluted by corpses. However, he declared he had never drunk anything better. since whenever he drank, before he said he had never known what it was to be thirsty. Similarly, Ptolemy had never felt hungry when he ate, and so when in the course of a tour around Egypt he got separated from his escort and was given some coarse bread in a cottage, he said he had never enjoyed anything so much in all his life. There was also a tradition about Socrates. He liked walking. It is recorded until a late hour of the evening, and when someone asked him why he did this, he said he was trying to work up an appetite for his dinner. He goes on, and he simply gives more examples from the Spartans about their frugal life. And he goes on really here. I'm not going to go on reading because Cicero's a rather long-winded fellow. And he goes on giving you examples one after the other. Now this is part of a passage where he attacks Epicurus, and I haven't got to his arguments against Epicurus at all. I'm just giving you an example of Cicero's writing. This is Cicero.
It sure is, and it's very difficult to explain why it is that Cicero is one of the great men. That is, when you make up a list of the 100 great books, for some reason we pick 100. It's a good number. There certainly aren't more than 100. When you want to use the word great, and Cicero has to be on anybody's list. But it's hard to explain that. It's very easy to see why Homer is on the list, or why Plato is on the list. But it's not so, or even, I guess, why Caesar is on the list. But it's very difficult to explain. I think Cicero is the first author we'll have to defend. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think that's true. And one of the things that you miss to some extent is that immediate pleasure that he's talking about there in his.
Yes.
That is, you don't get the sort of pleasure that you get from drinking a glass of wine, or it isn't that immediate pleasure that you get even from reading Lucretius or reading Caesar, because there you are, you're right there with Caesar there on that great campaign.
How can you fail to respond to Caesar when, even if he were not one of the great writers of the world, he certainly was one of the great actors of the world. And we read books by great men simply because they're great men, not because they're great writers. I don't suppose anyone would ever read, the journals of Lewis and Clark if Lewis and Clark had not gone all the way to Oregon and back with 45 men at a time when it was impossible to do it. And so you're just in such admiration. Or to take a modern example, people still read the book by Charles Lindbergh, about himself and his airplane, because Charles Lindbergh was the first man to fly across the Atlantic. And I don't think anybody has ever done it even since. That is with the same. I just heard
there's a fellow who tried it just the other night.
He failed twice.
Yeah.
He failed twice. That is with the same kind of equipment.
Yeah.
Of course, with modern planes, you can easily. But there's some young fellow who started out to recapitulate Lindbergh's flight, and he's twice turned back. And you realize what an astonishing thing that was. I don't suppose Charles Lindbergh was a great writer, but because he was such a marvelous person, we read his book and we respond to it.
Well,
it's a lot of that in Caesar, I think.
Yeah. Well, in a way, you say, well, if you were able to do what these men did, to go like Admiral Byrd to the North Pole, if you could do that, then you could write a book about it yourself. You wouldn't have to be an extraordinary writer to write a book about a great accomplishment.
Just tell the plain truth.
Just tell the truth, what you did.
It turns out that Caesar is a good writer because he knows that. He doesn't embellish. He just tells the plain and simple truth. And we talked a lot about Caesar as a writer. He is astonishingly good. But what I mean is, you don't have to defend the book because everybody knows that Julius Caesar was one of the greatest men. If not, I think we went all the way out and said he's the greatest man who ever lived. But we do have to raise this question with Cicero because, Cicero was a great man too. But he was a politician and not a general. He didn't fly over the Atlantic in a single-engine airplane. He was that sort of a fellow who lived in the ordinary, day-to-day, practical life of a politician. And he was a very good one. He was in the Roman Senate for his entire life. And he died. Finally, he was murdered, executed, for what he believed. What he believed in was the Republic. He believed in the free political life. That's what he believed in. And that's very hard to defend. You can defend great dictators. They're exciting people. Like Caesar, who take the law into their own hands and cross the Rubicon and set things straight. But Cicero was the compromiser, the fellow who worked it out in committees and who sat up until 3 o'clock in the morning with his opponents trying to flatter them. And I don't know, but maybe on occasion he might have even bribed them, although he was scrupulously honest. I don't suppose he ever did, actually.
He wasn't accused of it, I don't believe.
No, I think he was.
He would have been if he had.
That's one of the reasons why he's hard to defend. Even criminals make exciting reading. But Cicero was a scrupulously honest man. But what he did is enormously important in the history of the world. We sum all this up, I think, by saying that Cicero is the greatest rhetorician in the history of Western civilization. Now, we talked a little bit about the art of rhetoric, which got its start in Greece, and we talked quite a bit about it in Thucydides, because Thucydides makes a great use of rhetoric. You remember, his history consists largely of debates. One man will get up and present a case for fighting the war, and the other man will get up and present the case against it. So that Thucydides' history does use a lot of rhetoric, but still, you might remember, we finally described Thucydides as being a poet, a writer of tragedy. That is, he has the tragic view of life. He made use of rhetoric, but he's primarily a poetical man. I mean, we finally have to say that he is in a class rather with Aeschylus or Euripides. And so this is the first time I think we've come up against this, not only this man, this great man, but also this great branch of human knowledge. We've talked a great deal about poetry and something about philosophy.
And history.
And history. We haven't talked about rhetoric, what it is, and its place in our lives, and its importance. And it's hard to defend.
Well, it does have to do primarily with the field of experience that we call politics, the political life. Caesar was, to some extent, engaged, to a very large extent, engaged himself in the political life.
But he never played it. He never played the game.
No. He was a general in politics, you might say. But he never engaged. We don't have any speeches, so far as I know. We don't have any speeches by Caesar at all. He made speeches occasionally, and he was considered to be very good, I understand. But his speeches have not survived. He wasn't a great orator as was Cicero, and the political life itself is hard to defend. That is, when you're talking about greatness, it's hard to put it in the same class with what Caesar achieved, or what the events that Herodotus or that Thucydides were writing about, these great events. It's very hard because we say they transcend politics. War is, although I think a lot of people think that war is a kind of political affair, and perhaps Thucydides himself thought it was. Nevertheless, war transcends politics. It brings out qualities and virtues and events that are beyond the sphere of politics.
I have some famous man, so famous that I shouldn't forget who he is, but I have. Who was it who said, politics is the art of the possible? It's certainly true, whoever said it, I can't remember. But poetry deals with the impossible. Poetry calls down fire from heaven. Caesar was a kind of a living embodiment of the poetic principle. That is, he interfered with human life in an impossible way. When he crossed the Rubicon and took over the Roman state, he did something superhuman. The dictator is a superman. As we know, the modern philosopher Nietzsche made a whole political philosophy out of this idea that some people are just born to do that, and that they're the ones who make history. But, and it's a very important but. We've talked about this before. I think just last time or the time before, I haven't remembered now, we talked about Carlyle, who held that view that great men make history. Maybe it was when we were talking about Caesar. But, I have to come back to that but. What happens between great men? They come along about every 500 years. Who is it who lives that day-to-day life, that ordinary life? I always remember the story of the drunk who said, when he was trying to be cured of his drunkenness, and someone was trying to cure him with a lot of good advice about how to get through a crisis, and he said, "Oh, I can handle any crisis. That's not a problem. It's that day-to-day living. It's that day-to-day living that I can't handle." The politician in the statesman in the Ciceronian sense is the fellow who handles that day-to-day living, that ordinary way. There are mountains like Caesar, and there are chasms like Lucretius, but human life is largely lived out on the plains, like here in Kansas. And we look out this window and we don't see a spectacular view. I used to live in Wyoming, and out my window there were snowy mountains. In fact, it was called the Snowy Range. And I could sit there and look out the window and see this just spectacular landscape. And I retreated from it. It's too much. It's like, how would you like to have an original Leonardo da Vinci painting in your living room? I don't think you could stand it. You'd have to get out of the living room. It's not meant for quiet, ordinary day-to-day living. We have to live with that middle ordinary landscape, I think, and that's Cicero.
In a way, you say Cicero he's a man of great ability, extraordinary ability and extraordinary intelligence and range of knowledge, but there is a kind of mediocrity about Cicero.
See, every time you use a word like that, I know what you mean. But someone will say, "Oh, well."
You dismiss him.
You dismiss him. Not at all.
Reason. But that's not.
No, he is a great mediocrity.
It's a great. There is such a thing as greatness in mediocrity. Yeah. Another way of putting it is to say that you see in the cases, in the examples that we have read before, if you go back to the Homeric literature, you see heroes who go far beyond what is called the call of duty. They transcend duty. They do more. This is the reason that we decorate heroes. We still use the word in warfare. We say, well, if someone who's done a heroic deed, we mean that he has gone beyond the call of duty. Everyone is supposed to do their duty. As Winston Churchill said, England expects every man to do his duty. Wasn't that Churchill?
Yeah, I don't know. But to go beyond it, that's what we talked about this before under the rubric of honor.
Yes.
To go beyond that.
Right, but then we say, well, but you're not. You don't have to go beyond the call of duty. Not very many people are, as it were, called to go beyond the call of duty. They sometimes they never even get an opportunity to go beyond the call of duty. They simply do their duty. The ordinary soldier who fights in the war isn't decorated at all. He never does anything heroic, possibly because he never has that opportunity. He still risks his life, and he's still brave and still fights the enemy, but he never goes beyond duty. And you would say, well, that describes Cicero. Not that Cicero was without courage, because he had great courage, but then so does the ordinary soldier fighting in the war.
Yeah, the ordinary soldier wins the war.
Yeah.
And there is a time when you sit back and say, I've had enough of people who go on beyond the call of duty. That is, most of them lose the war. Most of them mess it up. In trying to go beyond their duty, they fail to fulfill the duty. You can't count on them. They do spectacular things, and then they do nothing.
Well, we praised. I think I can't remember. I think it was when we were talking about. I think it was when we were talking about Plato in the Republic. We got to talking about we got to comparing different kinds of soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the aristocratic soldier and especially the timocratic soldier as compared to the oligarchic soldier. And I think our praise went mainly to the timocratic soldier as the superior soldier who is perfectly suited to the military life. And I think probably we compared and we contrasted someone like George Patton to someone like Dwight Eisenhower during World War II. Obviously, Patton is one of those terribly exciting men who do spectacular things, who always are going beyond the call of duty, and who are consequently a great nuisance to the ordinary soldiers. That is not only Eisenhower, but people like Omar Bradley, who was one of the more, again, very ordinary kind of man, and without any great brilliance, who you say, well, all they did was win the war. That's all they did. And you don't want to say that Patton didn't contribute a great deal to winning it, but when you put the total achievement of Patton beside the total achievement of someone like Eisenhower, you say, well, if it weren't for Eisenhower, they wouldn't have, or we'd say, well, it wouldn't even have to be Eisenhower himself. He just happened to be the man that was there. If it weren't for people like that, put it that way, we wouldn't have won the war at all.
Nobody in his right mind would make Patton the
Supreme Allied commander. Oh, no.
Absolutely not.
It was the same with Montgomery. The English had Montgomery. He was the same type, but no one would have wanted him to be the Supreme Allied commander.
I suppose when I say it's hard to defend Cicero, maybe that should be qualified. It's hard to defend Cicero to youth. The youth doesn't like him. The youth feels that call to honor, to find quarrel in a straw, and to go off and fight even about nothing, because what he wants to do is to win honor.
Like young Fortinbras.
Yes. And in the famous 7 Ages of Man speech, doesn't old Jaques, when he talks about the soldier, have some phrase like that he's. Then comes the soldier.
Full of strange oaths.
Strange oaths and. I don't remember the exact words. I thought maybe there was even a phrase in there where he talks about quarreling, doesn't he?
Quarreling, yeah.
Something about with his quarrels and his something or other. Shakespeare is full of young soldiers. You mentioned Fortinbras in Hamlet at the end of the play, and maybe the greatest one he ever invented is Mercutio. The very name conjures it up. It's from the god Mercury. He's Mercurial. Mercutio, who is Romeo's best friend. And again, he dies in a duel. It's boom, let's fight for honor. Let's fight for the sake of fighting. Whereas Cicero's book is called De Officiis, on offices. That is, on your official duty. The proper translation of it is on duty. And it's a book written by Cicero to his son. Now, I don't think his son liked the book very much. Otherwise, Cicero wouldn't have had to write it, for one thing.
Well, this is what you can imagine him in college in Greece, which is where he was when he got these letters from his father. You can just imagine him saying, "Well, there goes the old man again.
Telling me what to do, telling me what my duty is.
Yes.
Now get up in the morning and make your bed and get to class and read the books and this is your duty, and it's very important to do your duty because." And then he goes into the reasons why. And young people are just impatient with duty. They say, "Oh, that's so pedestrian. That's so mediocre." It's a paradox to say it, but Cicero is a great mediocrity. He is a mountain of a hill. That is, he lives here in Kansas. He's out on the plains with very humanized, well cultivated hills. But given that life, I have to put it paradoxically, he's great. He's a giant. He's a mountain.
Well, there is a kind of perfection in all of these types. Going back to the Platonic classifications of men and of societies. He starts with the aristocrat, who is the best, and the timocrat comes next, who is the next best. Third down the line comes the oligarch, and he is not nearly as spectacular nor as admirable as the aristocrat or the timocrat, but he does have admirable qualities. And he's a distinct.
Let's say
he's
good
distinct.
qualities.
Yes.
Admirable is your favorite word.
Well,
something that strikes you with wonder.
Yeah, it doesn't do that. I'm using it in the more modern sense of the word.
But admirable is not coextensive with good. I think we have to make that distinction.
True. Yes,
there are people who are not admirable in the sense that they strike you with awe, but they're good. That is, they do the good. They lead the good life. And on the contrary, there are a lot of admirable people who are not good.
Yes. Now, Cicero is a man who we say this whole course takes up books that we call classics. Another way of saying great books is to say classic books. And Cicero realizes perfectly a certain kind of person. He's the kind of person who really runs the world. So he's rather numerous, and that's he doesn't stand out very much from the crowd. He rather represents. I don't want to say the crowd. When you talk about the crowd, you're talking about democracy, and we're not. And that's much lower down on the scale.
As I say, he represents the Commonwealth. He represents the propertied people, the men of goodwill, not the mob. He hated the mob. He saw in the democratic man, in Plato's use of that word democratic, that is the mob, he saw in that the destruction of the Roman Republic.
Well, he was a wise man. Of course, he had read the Republic. He knew the Republic, and he knew. I think he knew the state of the Republic. That is, it was an oligarchic state, not aristocratic or timocratic, and but he knew that the state that comes after the democratic or the oligarchic state is democracy, and he could see it. It was there, right in Rome. There was a Roman mob. And there were demagogues all over the place in Rome who were seeking to curry favor with that mob, to win them over and to give them power and encourage them in such a way as to really overthrow the republic.
And they were the Timocrats. That is, he lived in an age when the democracy was going under. It was the age of Catiline and Mark Antony, just to mention the two most famous of those rich young men from the old aristocratic families who had been born into the democratic tradition. And they were full of honor, and they were lazy. They were full of romantic love, and they were dissolute and lustful. Cicero despised them, just despised them.
Yeah, well, there's nothing worse than a decadent timocrat. When you see, once again, if you were in such a society, you would then see the virtues of the oligarchic man very, very clearly. You would see the superiority of the oligarchic man, and you'd vote for the oligarchic man under those circumstances.
When you read the Three Musketeers, maybe it would be a good idea to put Cicero down and read the Three Musketeers, and then go back and read Cicero. You're seeing the timocratic man at his best, and a book like that celebrates the wonder and glory of the timocratic man, riding around on his horse, drinking a little too much, but still it's all for the queen. And riding in the battle and risking his life. But when that man becomes a drunkard, and when he doesn't just fall in love, but he grovels in a dissolute, low life, you can see how good the oligarchic man is.
Well, the whole society, you can see, is going under those circumstances. Yeah. The whole society is.
There's nothing worse than one of those drunken louts who wears the spurs and who wears all the costumes of his grandfather, and who hasn't really got the life, and in fact, who may even be himself a coward. That is, it's all show and bluster and phony. He's got the clothes and he's got the language, but the heart is going out of it. Cicero, I guess if you wanted to sum them up in two words, they're his words. He uses them all the time. The bonum honestum, the honest good. He sees the good life not as the glorious good, but as the honest good. And that has to do with doing your duties. And you were just reminding me, because I'd forgotten. It's been a long time since I've read this book. That the whole of Book 1 is on the virtues.
Yes.
And that's the word. That is the bonum honestum, is about the virtues.
Yes.
The word honesty is used in a large sense.
Yes.
Of doing the right thing to your neighbor, of being just to your neighbor, giving him his due.
Yeah, it's from the same root as honor. But honest, it doesn't really mean the same thing as it isn't the honorable, but rather the honest.
Because it's not beyond duty, it's duty. It's what you owe. It's giving somebody what you owe. An honest man is a guy who pays his debts.
Right. Yeah, just in the simplest sense of the word. That's the definition of an honest man. He tells the truth, and he pays his debts. That's the best example, is paying your debts, because it's monetary, and the oligarchic man is a man who deals with money, with property, with goods, as we call them, not with the good, the summum bonum, but rather with goods, the right thing to do. And very often that does have to do with matters such as property and money and the law. You remember
Cicero was a lawyer. We didn't say
Cicero
that.
was a lawyer.
He was a professional lawyer.
And you begin, when you get an oligarchic society, you get a lot of lawyers. In fact, all of the people in the Senate are lawyers. That's the norm anyway, as it is, let's say, in the American Congress, and as it is in most of the Congresses of the world during an oligarchic era. They're all men who became lawyers and then went into public service and were often elected to office, and they serve as legislators, that is, lawmakers, because that's their business. They know the law. Everything is settled by law. Everything is settled by contract. It's no longer a society which depends upon a man's word of honor. That's a purely democratic conception because, frankly, the democratic man's word of honor isn't worth anything anymore in this society. His whole
a liar.
Yes, his whole class has gone downhill, and he's a guy who now might cheat at cards, for example. That's one of those classic examples. He takes to gambling. His money is all gone.
He gambles, like we talked about gambling as the old democratic idea of putting your life on the line,
Yeah.
but now he cheats.
Now he cheats. He not only goes and plays cards, but he cheats. It's the worst, most dishonorable thing that you can imagine, but it really happens. There are lots of stories about this. It's so base a thing to do for a nobleman to cheat, especially to make money. You see, he won't go out and get a job. He's a nobleman. He's not supposed to have a job where you go out and work and earn money. He would consider it beneath him to become a lawyer, to buy and to sell his services. He considers that beneath him, and it is beneath the democratic man. But in a decadent society, decadent democratic society, he has no means of income, and as a result, he is often forced to try to get money by some sort of dishonorable means. But he will never work.
He borrows.
He borrows. That's right. He's
gets
often
into the hands
debt.
of the usurers.
Yeah. That's another favorite theme is the destitute nobleman who has to go out and borrow money to live.
And he sells off his family heirlooms, which is dishonorable. Sells his name frequently with base marriages because he marries for money. That is, he sells his noble name. All of those things, they've been detailed in novel after novel. Well, this is one of the things that Cicero had, as it were, to look up to. That is, when he looked to the class above him and saw this degenerate democracy, he pulled himself together and said, "No more of this. That is, we're going to have a government which is honest. We're going to have people who pay their debts. We're going to have laws that are obeyed." Now, one of the reasons why it's hard to defend Cicero is, especially to young people, is that young people are, at that time of life, youth is rather addicted to democracy. That is, young people in any age, no matter what the age is, whether it's aristocratic or democratic or oligarchic or democratic, youth as a time of life tends to admire the democratic man. And so it's rather difficult to get him to read Cicero at all just because of the time of life. Another reason why Cicero is hard to see, I think, is that we today, in the 1980s, are living exactly at a time when the oligarchy is decadent. That is, when someone says to you, lawyer, we tend to throw up our hands and say, well, they're the worst crooks there are.
Well, or politician. Politician
yeah.
is a dirty word.
That's because the oligarchic is now going into the democratic, and what we see is the democratic man getting elected to Congress. Now, Cicero despised them as well. He was caught really between two terrible events, the Timocratic and the Democratic. He lived in between, and he stands there really like a marvelous. Now I've lost my image. He's standing there pushing both sides back with his hands. I can see him with his hands stretched out, almost as if he was on the cross, holding back on the one hand the decadent aristocracy and holding back this rising mob of democracy. And it doesn't last long. I think we say that when we first talked about Plato's ages, that the oligarchic society doesn't last long. It's the aristocratic doesn't last long; it lasts one generation. The timocratic lasts for 1,000 years because it's based on precedent. It's based on family, on handing things down from father to son. It's based on tradition, so it lasts a long time. But the oligarchic society seldom lasts longer than 100 years. At the most, a couple of 100 years. It's impossible to stretch it out. It tends to burn itself out. It tends to use itself up.
Well, of course, it is based on law, and it is also based on the accumulation of wealth. It's a money society, and it's a utilitarian society. And what happens is, of course, as in all of these societies, it is successful. It succeeds in producing wealth and happiness, insofar as wealth presents happiness, and the result is that it brings about its own demise, that is, its own decadence, because the children of the oligarch have lost the spirit of their fathers. Here, well, just I think yesterday, Henry Ford II died. Now, Henry Ford I was one of the original oligarchs.
He almost retires it, doesn't he?
Oh, he was just, now you want an example in modern history, it's Henry Ford I. He was honest. He was very, very enterprising, hardworking, very practical man who kept his nose to the grindstone, who invented the modern factory system really in this country, who was very austere in his own life, lived a very simple life. He was famous for tipping everybody a dime, remember? And he thought that that was the right thing to do. You don't want to spoil people by giving them too much. You want everybody to work their way up from the bottom the way he did. He didn't have any great wealthy fathers to support him. He didn't come from any noble family. He was just a poor fellow who worked his way up to the top by being aggressive and diligent and honest too. And
turned out a good product.
Yeah. And he turned out a good product. Whereas, Henry Ford II was, as everybody says, he did come back after World War II. He saved the Ford Motor Company, brought it back into success. But Henry Ford II himself was well known as a kind of playboy. He still hung on. He was still the chairman of the board, and he still ran the Ford Motor Company.
Oh, but he never could have done what his grandfather did. No.
Well, he didn't have to. His grandfather had already done it. Right. I mean, he invented the Ford automobile.
In between was Edsel.
Edsel, oh yes, Edsel was
going down as a joke.
He's
going down as a joke. And again, it might not even be fair. I don't know anything about him, but in the popular press, he's going down as a joke.
He didn't outlive his father. No. His father came along and had to take over again after Edsel kind of put them back in the soup. Put them in the soup.
You can see that working out. That is, if you're brought up in a house where your father or your grandfather has already made $1 billion. What does money really mean to you? I mean, it's silly to say to Henry Ford II, who is the grandson, of the old man. It's kind of silly to say, now you got to get out there and work hard. He says, why? What do I have to? We don't need any more money.
Yeah.
We have more money than we can spend. It did say in the newspaper that Henry Ford II, it said something like, a spokesman at the Ford mansion said, well, I don't think Henry Ford I even had a mansion. He didn't like things like that. He drove around in an old Ford himself. He was a hard-working man with abstemious taste, but his grandson, is it? You say he's a playboy.
He's a jet setter. Yeah. That's what everyone said.
He had 3 or 4 wives.
Yeah, that's right. And he lived in the high style. Well, his father would not have approved.
No.
Just as Cicero would not approve if his son took up that high style. But it's what are they to do? What are you to do when you inherit $1 billion? Well, you live in the style that's expected of you.
And yet there's no tradition.
Yeah.
See, I mean, the oligarchic man doesn't believe in tradition. He believes in making money. You see, if you inherit a great estate in the old democratic tradition, you are brought up with the understanding that your job is to administer that estate. You can read about it in Chaucer, where the knight rides along with his son, the squire, and you can see how the squire is being trained to follow in his father's footsteps, and he's going to do the same thing his father did. But how can Edsel Ford do the same thing his father did? It can't be done again. It's a totally different view of life. It is non-traditional.
Yeah. Yeah, there isn't a
they call it creative. They call it creative.
Yeah.